Hello there once again. This is Jennifer McGuire, and I thank you so much for stopping by. Today I am doing a subtle resist technique. This is a great technique because it creates soft backgrounds, and you can do it with inks that you likely already have and any stamps that you want. So you can see on all my card examples here, there's a soft pattern in the colorful background, and then I'm able to create a focal point on top of that with additional stamping. This is also a great technique for one-layer cards, and you can either make simple or more complex designs. Each of my examples will share this technique using different inks, so you'll see how they all react to this technique. Also, I'll be sharing a new product that I've fallen in love with and I think you might like too. But let's go ahead and get started with this first example here, and I create a subtle resist backdrop for white heat embossed sentiment. Many of the products that I'm using in today's video are from Sweet and Sassy. I had never used their stamps before, but I noticed the owner of Sweet and Sassy in a bunch of different Facebook groups, and I found that she was so kind and very impressive, so I decided to go over and place an order for some of her stamps, and I found a lot that I really liked. She has many that are faith-based, but she has other things too, and I'll use several today. So I'm starting with one of these images, and I'm stamping it with Versamark ink onto white cardstock. You can use any embossing ink for this. I use Versamark ink in almost all of my videos. And I decided to double stamp this. I really wanted to be sure that I transferred a lot of ink to that cardstock. Next, I'm going to heat set it, and I'm going to do this until there's no shine to that ink, until I'm sure it's completely dried. Basically, the image will disappear into the cardstock, but that's okay. Now it's time for the fun, colorful resist. I'm using my Waffle Flower Water Media Mat. You can use any surface to do your blending on, but I have found that this is a great blending surface, and you'll see more why as I do more examples. Here I am applying Distress ink with ink blending tools. I'm using Salty Ocean, Peacock Feathers, and Mowed Lawn. I'm putting this down with a pretty heavy hand, and I'm being very sure to overlap the colors. The more you overlap, the better the blending will be. So you can see how that green and the teal aren't blending well until I go and overlap them more. Once I'm done doing that, I like to buff off any excess ink from where I stamped. And you can see how the Versamark ink gives a subtle resist. It resists that ink we put on top. And it's just this beautiful ghost-like image. After I trimmed it down, I decided to go add a little bit of dark color to the edges. I like to do this with my Distress inks. So I put some Blueprint Sketch towards the bottom and more Mowed Lawn towards the top. I find this technique works really well with Distress inks, but again, I'll show you the results with other inks later in this video. Okay, so now I'm going to heat set this completely. I want to make sure it's dry because we're going to add a sentiment on top. I decided to use the Sweet and Sassy Life in Jesus stamp set. I thought that faith word was just gorgeous and perfect for on top of the stamping that we just did. Now I want to test my piece and see if it's ready for heat embossing. The way I test it is I pour some embossing powder on it. If it sticks, then it's not ready. And I did that and it isn't ready, so I'm heat setting it some more and using an anti-static powder bag. I'll test it again. The embossing powder falls right off, so I know I'm ready to do my stamping. Okay, so I've placed my faith word right on top of my inked background. Use my anti-static powder tool again just to be sure. Ink that up with Versamark ink, and then I added my white embossing powder and heat set. After trying a bunch of backgrounds for this piece, I decided subtle was best, so I used the Altenew Dotted Scales Debossing Cover Die. I cut this from Simon Says Stamp Sea Glass cardstock. You can see that subtle dot pattern in the background. And I put this all together on a 4 1/4 by 4 1/4 inch note card. I also used the Simon Says Stamp Tiny Words Faith stamp set, which I've used in previous videos, to white heat emboss Praying for You under the word faith. So this card shows how you can get a subtle resist look by inking over a dried Versamark stamped image. Now, if you look on my envelope there in the background, I did stamp something on it, and it's from the Stamp Market Made with Love stamp set. I thought these were all great for stamping on envelopes. Some of them are for treats that you might make, but I like the Made with Love, and you can see here on this one, it's a little handmade seal that's perfect to put on envelope flaps. Okay, let's go ahead and do another example, this time using different inks, just so you can see how different inks work with this technique. I'll be using the Sweet and Sassy Birds and Blooms stamp set. I'll actually be using the flowers and the bird, but not a sentiment from this. But check out the sentiments because I think they're really nice and fit into small areas. Okay, so I have white cardstock, and once again, I'm stamping my images with Versamark ink. I decided to double stamp just to make sure that I get a lot of ink on my paper. If you do this technique and your image doesn't show up much, it might be because your Versamark ink or your embossing ink pad is getting dry. So you can try re-inking it or using a new pad. I recently got a new pad because mine was getting pretty nasty looking, and this really worked great for this technique. I did try it with an older ink pad and it worked well, but I found that if I had a juicy Versamark ink pad, it worked better. Okay, so I heat set that completely, and this time I'm using Altenew inks. This is another dye ink, and I'm using Picket Fence Life-Changing brushes. These are the brushes that I like to use when I'm putting a soft amount of color on my background. If I want to put a lot of color down, I usually reach for my ink blending tools like I did on the last example. I wanted to show you here that you can do a soft amount of color to get this resist technique over the Versamark ink, as you can see I'm doing here. I'm putting a few different colors of Altenew inks together, including magenta, orange cream, and sunray. So there's a softer look there. You can see the resist a bit, but I prefer putting a bold amount of color on top. I find that the image pops out more and it just looks more impressive. So I went back and added more color on top just to make it a little more bold, but you could have left it softer if you prefer. Once I'm done, I just buff off the excess and then I'll heat set it. Heat setting it also makes the Versamark image pop out a little bit more too. Okay, now it's time to stamp our little bird here, and this is where I share with you the product that I've been using lately that I am crazy about. I'm super excited about it. This is the new Altenew Obsidian Black ink. This ink stamps so crisp and so dark. It is a quick drying pigment ink, so you could heat emboss with it if you wanted to, or just let it dry. I like the ink pad. The lid comes off easily, so I can quickly use this. And I think this will be my go-to ink for sentiments. Now, I'm not going to color this bird. This just I thought would be fun to leave black and white. But I encourage you to check out that ink pad if you're looking for a very dark, crisp black ink. Okay, now as far as the sentiment on this card, I'm using the Sweet and Sassy Be Encouraged stamp set. Lots of faith-based encouragement sentiments here. And I'll stamp this on the bottom of my card with that obsidian ink. And you can see here how crisp this stamps. Super dark, really easy to use. I'm very excited about it. Now I will stick with my amalgam ink for most of my stamping that I do coloring. But this is one that I think would be good for my sentiments. Okay, so now I'm adding this onto my panel. And then I will add this panel onto my card using craft foam. So I'll put craft foam behind it so it has some dimension. I also added a few iridescent gems to the background just for a little bit of sparkle. And I stamped Made with Love from that Stamp Market stamp set that I showed you earlier. Here you can see the subtle resist that we got in the background of these bright colors. I could have covered the entire piece with the stamping, but I thought it was fun just to have a little bit in the corner. You can also see here how crisp that ink stamped for my sentiment and for the bird. And this shows that you can use your Altenew inks for this technique. Any dye ink should work. Okay, here's another example. This time I'm using a background stamp. So off screen on white cardstock, I stamped the Hero Art Starry Night background stamp with Versamark ink, and I heat set it. Now on top, I'm applying distress ink. I'm using Seedless Preserved, Wilted Violet, and Picked Raspberry, and I'm making sure to blend those colors together. Here you can see how a background stamp is perfect for this technique, and it resists the distress ink that we put on top. Along with that background, I'm using the Sweet and Sassy Landscape Silhouette stamp set. I'll be using the two on the bottom there, but there are a good variety in here, and they're great for kind of silhouette techniques like the one we're doing today. On this one, I'm going to use the Be Encouraged 2 stamp set. You saw the first one before. This is another one, so you can take a look at the different sentiments and see if either has what you want. Okay, so I have trimmed that background down, and I have a note card in my Misty stamping tool here. And I'm going to do a little trick that I like to do when I want my stamp to go across the entire card, including the raised areas. So I have my background piece on my note card. I'm positioning my sentiment and my little silhouette of a lighthouse. Now I'm taking that piece away, and I'm going to stamp with that obsidian black ink onto my note card. You can see how perfectly black that stamps and nice and crisp. Now I'm going to put the background piece back in place where I want it to be in the end. And I'm going to stamp again. That way that silhouette image is on both the inked piece and on the note card. So now I'm going to take a piece of craft foam and glue that to the back of our inked piece. This will give it raised dimension. You could use foam tape if you wanted to. Now I'm putting some liquid adhesive on the back of that and adding it onto our card, making sure to line up the stamping. I just think this is a fun trick to make a stamped image go across your note card, so it kind of ties your inked piece in with the background. Now to finish this off, I added a few little tiny iridescent star sequins, kind of around the lighthouse in the sky. So you don't really see them there, but when we get up close, you'll see how it catches the light. I also took a Gina K Plum Punch envelope because I thought that was a perfect match, and stamped a sentiment on there from that Stamp Market stamp set. So here you can see how this technique of subtle resist is great with background stamps. After making that last card, I had a strip of that subtle resist left over, and I didn't want it to go to waste. So I just made this quick card with that scrap. I'm not going to walk you through it. I'll just show you what I did though. This is the Sweet and Sassy Long Stem Silhouette stamp set. I'll use this again later in the video. I really like these tall, narrow floral images. They're great for cards like this where we use scraps. I'm also using the line stamp on the bottom of this Simon Says Stamp Hello Darling stamp set. I've used this one recently because I like the sentiments, but I thought the lines would be fun on this card. So on that resist piece, that long strip, I white heat embossed the floral image, and I matted it with white cardstock. Below that, I stamped a sentiment, and then I used that Hello Darling stamp set for those lines that you see there. And I stamped those with Lawn Fawn Ballet Slippers ink. I like the light colors of Lawn Fawn ink. I think they're a good addition to any ink collection because they give very soft results. Since I liked this background stamp for this technique, I decided to do another card. So I used the Starry Night background stamp from Hero Arts again, stamped it with Versamark ink on white cardstock, and applied Distress ink over it. This time I used Blueprint Sketch, peacock feathers, and tumbled glass. So you can see the blue sky that we get there. And then I stamped the palm tree silhouette at the bottom of that. I added some iridescent gemstones and a sentiment underneath. So you can see how this is a very simple card, but because we did that subtle resist technique, we add some fun to the background. Okay, my next example uses yet another ink line so you can see the results. On this one, I used the beautiful Wetland Grass stamp set from Sweet and Sassy. I just really like these images, especially the one on the right. You could stamp that and add tiny little flowers or sequins or gems to it. So what I did is I stamped that image multiple times on white cardstock with Versamark ink. After I heat set it, I'm using my life-changing brushes with Gina K Design ink. By working on this mat that you see here, I can put my excess ink onto the mat, but then go pick it back up with the brush and add it to my paper. So a lot less color goes to waste, and I just feel like I have good control over the piece as I'm adding the ink. So I put down key lime ink, we have Lucky Clover, some blue raspberry, and some ocean mist that I added to that background. Okay, so I went ahead and heat set that when I was done, and you can see our subtle resist. I do find that with the Gina K inks and like the Simon Says Stamp inks and the Hero Arts inks, the resist is a bit more subtle, which I really like. I want to go for a soft look for this technique. I chose a sentiment, and I'll stamp that right underneath, and I'm kind of planning out my card once again to do the black stamping as I showed you earlier. I thought I'd show the process again just so you can see it in action. I planned out where I want my pieces to be, and I first stamped them on the note card. And again, I'm using that new Altenew black ink, and watch how great this stamps right away. After I've done that, I can go ahead and get my inked piece, add it into the MISTI stamping tool, and stamp the leaf image once again, and that will line everything up when I assemble my card. So here's the final card. I added the inked piece with some craft foam behind it and added a few gems. I wanted a very subtle background on this card, so I used lighter color of ink. If you want it to stand out more, I would recommend using darker color ink. Even if you apply a light amount of a dark color, it will stand out more than using a lot of a light ink. I have one more subtle background example for you. I just wanted to show you this card. On this one, I used the Poppy Stamps Butterfly Wings stamp set. I am a big fan of butterfly stamps and dies, so this one caught my attention. I stamped it with Versamark ink on white cardstock and heat set it so it was completely dry. I then used my brushes to apply some Gina K ink. This time I used a little bit darker color, but not too much darker. I really wanted this to stay soft, so I went light on the inks. So after I cover it with purple, blue, and teal color ink, I trimmed it down. And then I heat set it completely so that I could white heat emboss that flower silhouette image on top. I also white heat embossed a sentiment and added it to a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. You can see those subtle butterflies in the background. In fact, you can see them better in real life. It doesn't really show up in the video very well here, but it's one of those techniques that gives a very soft, subtle background. Okay, there you have a way to use your Versamark or embossing inks with your dye inks to create a subtle resist. Give this a try. I think you'll like it, and it's a fun way to make soft backgrounds. If you're interested in any of the supplies that I talk about today, they are linked below, so you can find them there. In the middle are a couple other videos that you might like, including a technique that's similar using stencils. I also have much more information on my blog that's linked there in the top. I always got to say it, I appreciate you stopping by and spending this time here. I hope you learned a thing or two and that you'll return again soon. Take care.